It's my great pleasure to welcome at the launch of India's Techade the Minister of State for Skill Development and Entrepreneurship and Electronics and IT, Mr. Rajeev Chandrasekhar. Mr. Chandrasekhar, thank you very much for being here. We wish you would have been here in person at the event, but we know ministerial duties call, and thanks for making the time. So let me begin by asking you, from where you sit in the ministry, when we talk about India's Techade, now that's a catch-all kind of phrase. What does that mean to you, and how real is that?
So, Nalin, first of all, apologies for not being able to be in Delhi in person. There is this digital ministers meeting in Bangalore as part of the G20, and I want to first of all congratulate you and thank you for doing this book. And there's a reason why I say that, because the India Techade, the phrase that was in a sense coined by our Honorable Prime Minister almost 2 years ago, is a very powerful phrase or slogan in many ways, because it is signaling the way we see the opportunities around technology over the next decade. And to say that the next decade will be a decade full of technology opportunities for India and for young Indians is really what that phrase means. And it is an absolute, very simple yet clear way of describing our ambitions and goals as a country and as hundreds and thousands of young startups all over the country. For me in particular, as I see it, the vision around which the Honorable Prime Minister launched Digital India in 2015, which is that technology must empower and transform the lives of our Indian citizens. On one hand, that one pole. And the second is that technology must represent opportunities in innovation and entrepreneurship and therefore expansion of our economy. On the other hand, so these two poles, it started with, as you know, use cases like DBT and then UPI that really has transformed the whole narrative of dysfunctional governance that had plagued India for several decades. And now we are at an era or at an inflection point where we are looking to the future of innovation and expanding the digital economy from being 4% of our GDP in 2014 to 20% by 2026, and then 25% 3-4 years down the road. So it is a very, very powerful idea in terms of opportunities. It's a powerful idea in terms of our economic growth, and it's a powerful idea in terms of the maximum governance that our democracy is beginning to represent. In the backdrop of several decades of people saying democracies don't work and don't deliver. So I think in a lot of ways the India Techade is a decade full of technology opportunities for India and for young Indians.
So we are talking in a week when the Digital Personal Protection Act has just been passed.
Yes.
The Privacy Act.
Yes.
You've been very involved in that particular issue right from the time of the Aadhaar judgment.
Correct.
Then when the Supreme Court made privacy a fundamental right.
Correct.
6 years ago, and now in your role as a minister. When do we see the rules around this being framed, and when do we see this being activated? Because that's when the rubber will really hit the road, right?
So one of the clearly defining things about the difference between Prime Minister Narendra Modi ji as a leader and every other leader who was fascinated with technology before him is that he is not just fascinated with technology, he puts tire to the ground and effort in creating a framework of laws, of policies, of finances and resources to ensure that this vision is not just a vision, but it translates into real opportunities for our young Indians. So one of the big important elements of how he has looked at this is that we must create global standard, modern, future-ready legislative framework, laws. And why that is important is the principal law that in a sense regulates or governs the tech ecosystem today is a 22-year-old law called the IT Act. And so therefore, there are two pieces of this framework that the Honorable Prime Minister has envisaged. One is of course the DPDP, which is, as you correctly said, it's to do with privacy and data protection, as well as it lays out the defined rules for all of these startups that deal with data. On the other hand, there will be a new law to replace and succeed the IT Act, which will be the Digital India Act. So we believe we will have one of the most contemporary future ready legislations to deal with the technology ecosystem at large and the growing world of innovation and emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, the Web3, and so on and so forth in particular. So I think we are not just talking, Prime Minister doesn't just talk about the India Techade. He's putting all of those building blocks that are required to make this India Techade a real reality.
So one of the critiques of the Privacy Act now that it's
Sure.
been passed by both houses of Parliament is that there aren't enough safeguards for the role of the state,
Yeah.
or the language is up there. So your response to
Look,
that?
I think there will always be, we are data protection and privacy is such a contentious area, but in general, that there will be no such thing that meets 100% consensus and approved by everybody. There are always people who are absolutists who say protection is so absolute that there cannot be any exemption for anybody. In India, unfortunately for them, and to understand this, the Supreme Court has ruled this as a fundamental right. Fundamental right means there are reasonable restrictions. And so therefore what this bill does is seemingly achieves three very contradictory objectives. Seemingly contradictory objectives. One is protect the citizens' rights without any dilution, without any compromise. Defines the obligations on the startup and the innovation economy and the companies and the participants there in a manner that is not very compliance intensive, but it's still obligations that are very important, and carves out these emergency requirements of the government to access personal data in the event of a national security incident, in the event of an earthquake or a pandemic or situation like that. Now, there is no differential standards as far as the responsibility and obligation of the government to manage the personal data vis-a-vis the private sector. If the government-linked entity or a private sector-linked entity breaches data, they are both going to be dragged to the data protection board and adjudicated, that dispute adjudicated by the data protection board. And the jurisprudence that the DPB will evolve will set some basic guidelines of, regardless of company A or company B, big or small, foreign or Indian, there will be certain thresholds of punitive consequences that will emerge over time that cannot be shortchanged or second guessed by anybody. So I would respectfully say to people who say there is no safeguards, that is not correct. You please do read the bill. It is absolutely, everything is built with a great deal of clarity and accountability. And accountability and citizens' rights are essentially the guiding principles of all of the legislation that we build, all of the rules that we are delivering for the digital ecosystem.
And when the rules are actually activated and put out, the Data Protection Board will consist of?
The Data Protection Board will be an independent body, and they will consist of, currently we don't have any preconceived idea that it should have a judge or no judge. It should have, I actually think of these as modern institutions, need to be very nimble, very digital, very digitized, not the conventional bureaucratic kinds of institutions. These are institutions for the India Techade in a lot of ways. And so we would like to have people who come from different backgrounds. I don't see why a young lawyer should not be on the DPB. I don't see why a young serial entrepreneur should not be on the DPB. So I think we have not gone by the same old straight-jacketed mode, which says that there will be a retired bureaucrat and there will be a retired judge and there will be a retired this and a retired that. We don't see the Data Protection Board as a place for retired people. The institutions in the tech ecosystem that we intend to design and build have to be highly responsive, they have to be nimble, they have to be smart, they have to be intelligent, and they are in a lot of ways like Christopher Columbus, setting out and creating the jurisprudence for the future decade. So they have to be very, very capable people, and that's the only criteria that we will use.
So on data localization, we seem to have slightly easier rules now as well than such earlier. What's been the reaction?
Again, let me tell you, in the draft that we put out for consultation, our approach initially was that we would do a whitelisting, i.e. the government would determine all of these trusted jurisdictions where data can be stored in the cloud or data can be stored in a data center for processing. But during a consultation, it came about very quickly that government's ability to respond quickly where a startup says, look, I want to use a cloud in the US, or I want to use a cloud in the Germany or in Japan. The process of making that happen and then notifying it would be coming in the way of this nimble technology ecosystem and the startups' requirements of nimbleness. So what we said is, let us turn it around and say, we will allow data processing or use of the cloud or use of infrastructure to process data in any country, but progressively, the government has a right to notify some areas and geographies as untrusted and blacklist them. So for example, if there is a particular jurisdiction where we find that that jurisdiction is causing a lot of breaches, or that jurisdiction the law does not reach and our citizens' rights are compromised, or that jurisdiction is not trusted enough in terms of either the law or the safety of the personal data, we will certainly blacklist it. The government has a power under the law to say, this jurisdiction, no personal data of an Indian citizen should ever be processed.
And what about people who have published their personal data online voluntarily? Why does the law exempt them from protections?
Look, first of all, you cannot protect somebody who's gone and published. If I go put my photograph or my details out there, there's very little we can do to protect it. And in a sense, by putting it out there in public voluntarily, you are signaling that you don't consider that personal data to be protected. However, I want to clarify this very clearly through you, that nobody can use that personal data for any business purpose without the consent of that person. You may still put your data out there, but I, as a data fiduciary or a platform, will not be able to use your publicly available data for any business of mine unless I seek your consent. So in a sense, the bill is written in such a simple manner that is almost intuitive. How can you protect the data of somebody who has publicly and voluntarily put the data out there in public? Now, I want to give you the other side of it, which also needs to be explained, and we have addressed that, which is, if your data is in public today, unwittingly, that you have not had, and because in the pre-DPDP regime there is a lot of data floating around, we have said that on day zero, every data fiduciary that has personal data that it has obtained without consent is obliged to go and seek consent again from the person whose personal data it is, or give the right of that person to delete the data.
Okay.
So on day zero, there are only two scenarios. One is all of the data with the data fiduciary of the platform is going to be with consent. And the other scenario is that if your data is publicly available, it is being made publicly available by the data principal of his own volition, but still cannot be used for processing by any platform. People can see, okay, that name is there, that address is there, but I can't certainly put it in my model without seeking your consent.
So, one of the other things about the Techade, of course, is manufacturing,
Sure.
semiconductors, all of
Absolutely.
that. Let me ask you a question about that, because that's been in the news a lot, the ban on imports for laptops and computers and so on. There are fears that this is the return of a license Raj kind of thing.
Right.
Has now been deferred till 1st November. So your response to that?
So first of all, let me just take the first part of your question. I think it is very important to understand the way the Prime Minister sees the India Techade. It's a very, very different India Techade and technology ecosystem from what we saw in 2014 or what we had. If you remember, in 2014 there was hardly any manufacturing, and when we refer to digital economy, we almost always refer to ITES, which was a big business, 4 or 5 large companies, and then hundreds of small companies. So that was the technology ecosystem and digital economy in 2014. Today, our technology ecosystem and digital economy represents IT, ITES, deep tech, Web3, AI, manufacturing, semiconductor design, semiconductor manufacturing, high performance computing, supercomputing. So the whole spectrum of opportunities today represents the digital economy. Now within that, the electronics manufacturing piece represents a huge opportunity for India, and we have done very well in one or two categories like the smartphone category. We intend similarly to become a big force in the hardware, server, laptop category, and servers especially because India is becoming the fastest growing and the biggest market for IT hardware as our own cloudification and our own digitization progresses. This particular incident of, let us say, what is seen as curbing and unfortunately got communicated as licensing is anything but that. It got communicated that way, and there was obviously a quick clarification by the Commerce Ministry and our ministry that we will give 3 more months for this to be clarified. It is an import management system. What we want is we want to curb imports from certain geographies. We have no problem in imports. We have no problem in our digital economy currently depends almost certainly completely largely on imports. We want that to be replaced slowly, gradually with more and more domestic manufacturing. But in the interim, what we want is not an import curb as much as the import management, because we also want, as we digitize, we don't want to look back 3 years down the road and say we should have curbed certain geographies in terms of imports and manufactured products from those geographies. I won't talk about which geographies, but you certainly get the point about our dependence on certain geographies for IT hardware. So we certainly want to change that mix. We certainly want to improve that mix with larger and larger over time, over the medium term, Indian manufactured products. But the way, unfortunately, this policy came out, and and I'm happy to take the responsibility and the blame for it. We didn't communicate it when it came out. It came out in a little bit of a rush, and it was not well prepared. It came out looking like licensing. It is anything but that. This government, certainly this government, Prime Minister Nalin Mehta's government, will never go anywhere near quotas and licenses. If at all, we will go as far away possible from that. That's our DNA. That's our DNA in terms of. But we certainly have a responsibility to ensure that at this critical point when digitization of our economy is really accelerating, that we make sure that it's all trusted products that are coming into our market. And these are products that, whether they're laptops or servers or part of a cloud or part of a data center, that these are all trusted pieces of equipment.
Great. Thank you so much, Mr. Chandrasekhar. Any message for our panelists?
No, look, I think you're all, great participants and icons in the digital economy so far. And what we need really is more of you to inspire the young Indians who are today students and are going to enter the workforce and look for opportunities in the coming months and years. That the India Techade is a really exciting journey, and a lot of people believe that the young generation today, seeing all of you, are certainly the most excited and the most fortunate generation in the history of independent India, and more force to you, more power to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chandrasekhar, for joining us at the launch of India's Techade.